At our family lawyer's office, my sister slid a folder across the polished oak desk and said, "Just sign." Her voice was steady, almost casual, as though she was asking me to sign a greeting card, not something that carried the weight of a lifetime. I remember staring at the folder, its maroon cover too pristine, the corners sharp, as if it had never been touched by human hands until this moment. My fingers hovered above it, but I didn't reach out. Instead, I glanced at her face, searching for some hint of explanation. But she only kept her eyes on the folder, as though she couldn't bear to look at me directly. I read the last page twice, my lips barely moving over the words. At first I thought I must have misunderstood. But no, there it was in neat legal print, the signatures lined up like little betrayals, hers bold and confident, mine still absent. I let the silence stretch out, heavy, until it filled the room. That's when I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding or a poorly timed formality. This was deliberate. The lawyer cleared his throat, the way professionals do when they want to pretend they aren't intruding on something raw and personal. He shifted a pen toward me, the silver nib glinting under the fluorescent lights. I noticed then how sterile the office felt. The faint smell of furniture polish, the framed diplomas on the wall, the heavy drapes that muted the world outside. A room built to contain conflict, but never the kind of conflict that burns in the chest like this. I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended, "And if I don't?" That's when my sister finally looked at me. Her expression wasn't angry, nor was it pleading. It was fixed, resolute. Like a decision had already been made long before I walked in. "Then it'll drag on," she said, with a calmness that chilled me. "This way, it's simple. Clean. Simple. Clean." Words people use when they want to strip away the mess of human ties. Words that hide the truth of what they're taking. I leaned back in the leather chair, letting the words settle. I thought about the late nights we had spent years ago at our mother's kitchen table, splitting dessert and secrets, laughing so hard we cried. I thought about the day she called me, her voice trembling, when her marriage had begun to crumble, and how I had driven 3 hours just to sit with her, holding her hand in silence because that was all she needed. And I thought about the summers in the garden, our father's voice echoing across the yard, reminding us both that we were his girls, equal in his eyes. And now, here she was, sliding a folder as though all that history was just a faded photograph. My hand twitched, reaching for the pen, but I stopped short. "You should have told me," I said. The words felt useless, like pebbles thrown against a brick wall. Her shoulders rose and fell in a quick shrug. "You always make things complicated. This is for the best. For the best." Another phrase that disguises betrayal as logic. I pushed the folder back toward her, slowly, deliberately. The lawyer shifted in his chair, but I kept my eyes on my sister. "I'm not signing. Not today." Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she stood up, smoothing the creases of her blouse. "Then you're just dragging it out. Don't say I didn't try to make it easier for you." And with that, she left the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each step like a nail in the coffin of something I had once believed was unbreakable. I sat there for a long moment, the pen still resting on the desk between me and the lawyer. He didn't speak, and I was grateful for it. My throat was thick, and I knew if I tried to say anything more, my voice would betray me. Eventually, I stood, gathered my bag, and walked out of the office. The city outside felt louder than usual, the traffic sharper, the air colder. People hurried past, each of them wrapped in their own small battles, none aware that my world had shifted on its axis. As I walked to my car, I kept thinking of the word sister. How strange it sounded now. Once it had meant ally, confidant, the other half of my childhood. Now it felt like a blade pressed to my skin, reminding me that sometimes the cruelest cuts come not from strangers, but from those who know exactly where to strike. I sat in the driver's seat, the leather hot from the sun, and I let myself finally breathe. My hands trembled on the wheel. I didn't start the engine right away. Instead, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, my eyes red. I looked like someone who had been caught off guard, someone who had trusted too much. That drive home was a blur. I don't remember the traffic lights or the turns. I only remember arriving at my front door and fumbling with the keys, as though even the lock resisted me. Inside, the house felt both familiar and foreign, like I was returning to a place I no longer belonged. I set my bag down and stood in the middle of the living room. Everything was in its place, the books neatly arranged, the clock ticking softly, the photograph of our parents on the mantel. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Our mother's gentle smile, our father's steady gaze. They had raised us to believe in fairness, in loyalty. What would they think if they saw us now? The tears came then, sudden and unstoppable. I pressed my palms to my face, trying to muffle the sound, but the grief was too loud. It wasn't just about the papers, or the inheritance, or whatever justification my sister had convinced herself of. It was the betrayal. The quiet, calculated betrayal of someone who should have stood beside me, not against me. When the tears finally subsided, I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle. The small act felt grounding, ordinary. I stood there, listening to the whistle as the water boiled, the steam curling upward like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. I poured the tea, added a spoonful of honey, and carried the cup to the table. My hands steadied as I wrapped them around the warmth. I told myself I wouldn't call her. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. But deep down, I knew I would. Because family ties don't unravel in a single moment. They fray, strand by strand, and even when they should be severed, we cling to the last threads. That night, I sat awake long past midnight, the tea gone cold beside me, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but inside me there was a storm. I knew something had shifted permanently. I wasn't ready to face the full weight of it yet, but a part of me whispered that this might be the beginning of a different kind of life, one where I would no longer be defined by the people who had once held my trust so carelessly. I woke the next morning with the kind of heaviness that doesn't fade with sleep. My body felt rested enough, but my chest carried a weight, like a stone had settled there overnight and refused to move. The first thought that came to me wasn't about work or errands or breakfast. It was the folder. That maroon cover, my sister's calm voice, the pen pushed across the desk. For a moment, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, the light slanting in through the blinds. The world was carrying on outside, birds calling from the trees, a dog barking down the street, the faint hum of a garbage truck. All those ordinary sounds clashed with the extraordinary shift inside me. I had stepped into yesterday as one kind of person and walked out of that office as another. I made my way to the kitchen, each step heavier than it should have been. The kettle hissed as it boiled, the sound too sharp in the quiet house. I poured my tea, but the taste felt hollow, as though even the flavor had dulled. I sat at the table, staring at the cup, and found myself whispering aloud, "Just sign." The words mocked me, echoing her voice. I pressed my palms flat on the table, grounding myself. All morning, I kept circling back to one question: when did she decide to do this? Was it recent, a decision made in the chaos of grief and paperwork? Or had it been months in the making, a plan laid carefully, quietly, without me ever suspecting? The thought unsettled me more than anything. If it was sudden, then maybe it could be undone, explained. But if it was planned, if she had carried this in her heart while sitting across from me at dinners, while speaking to me on the phone, then it meant I had never really known her. The phone rang mid-morning, the sound jolting me. For a moment, I considered not answering. But habit won. It was our cousin, Mark. His voice was cheerful at first, but he quickly picked up on the strain in mine. "You okay?" he asked. I almost lied. It would have been easier. But instead, I found myself telling him the truth, or at least part of it. We were at the lawyer's office yesterday. My sister wanted me to sign something. Something I couldn't. There was a pause. I could almost hear him frown. Was it about the house? My silence must have been enough. I wondered if something like this might happen, he said finally, his tone cautious. She mentioned once, well, she said she thought you'd be more comfortable stepping back. That maybe you didn't want the responsibility. I gripped the phone tighter. She said that? Yeah, he replied gently. I didn't think much of it at the time. Families say things. But maybe she meant more. I thanked him and hung up soon after, but my hands shook as I set the phone down. Comfortable stepping back. That was how she'd painted me? As though I didn't care, as though I'd prefer to just fade into the background? The unfairness stung. All those years I had been there, for her, for our parents, for the family gatherings she sometimes skipped, and she had recast me as someone unwilling, uninterested. The rest of the day blurred. I moved through the motions, laundry, bills, a quick trip to the store, but everything felt dim, drained of meaning. Each small task was haunted by her voice, her certainty. I kept hearing her say, "It's for the best." Best for whom? That night, I pulled out the old photo albums. They had sat untouched on the bottom shelf for years, heavy with dust. I spread them across the living room floor and opened them one by one. The glossy pages held the younger versions of us, 2 girls grinning with ice cream cones, 2 teenagers in matching Christmas sweaters, 2 young women standing arm in arm at our father's retirement party. Each photograph was a fragment of a story I thought we had written together. But now, looking at them, I saw something else, the slow erosion, the small distances that had grown without me noticing. Her smile had always been just a little tighter, her arm around me a little looser. I closed the album and sat back, the silence pressing in. That's when the thought crept in, maybe this was never about fairness. Maybe it was about her need to rewrite the story of who we were, who I was. The following week, I avoided her calls. She left a few voicemails, each one short, clipped. We need to resolve this. The longer you wait, the worse it'll be. Her words were efficient, stripped of affection. They could have been left by a colleague, not a sister. I didn't delete them. I let them sit there, little reminders of how far we had fallen. One afternoon, unable to bear the weight of the house any longer, I drove to the park where our father used to take us as children. The air was crisp, the trees swaying gently, their leaves whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I sat on a bench, watching families stroll by, children chasing each other across the grass. A little girl laughed, her voice carrying across the park, and it pierced something in me. Once, that laughter had belonged to us. As I sat there, I realized I had a choice. I could let her version of me harden into fact, or I could begin to reclaim myself. Not in some grand, sweeping way, but in small, steady steps. The kind of steps no one notices until suddenly they add up to something undeniable. When I got home that evening, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a notebook I hadn't touched in years. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. I smoothed it open and began to write. Not about her. Not about the folder. But about me, the things I had loved, the moments I had lost, the dreams I had quietly set aside. The words came slowly at first, hesitant. Then they poured out, filling page after page. I wrote until my hand ached, until the world outside had gone dark and the only light was the lamp at my desk. When I finally closed the notebook, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Not peace exactly, but a flicker of it. A small spark reminding me that I was more than what she decided I was. That night, as I turned off the light and slipped into bed, I whispered into the darkness, I am still here. And though the words were small, they felt like a promise. The following days stretched into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated. I went to work, I cooked meals, I watered the plants, and yet every action seemed tethered to an invisible weight. My sister's folder was never far from my mind. Even when I wasn't thinking of it consciously, it lived underneath everything, like a hum you can't quite silence. I kept replaying that moment in the lawyer's office, her hand pushing the folder, her voice sharp with finality. Just sign. Those words hovered above me like a shadow. And yet, in the strange quiet that followed, something else had begun to stir inside me. It was fragile, like the first sprout pushing through winter soil, but it was there, the realization that I didn't have to accept the role she had written for me. One morning, I found myself drawn to the attic. It wasn't a place I visited often, dusty boxes, the smell of cedar and mothballs, the dim light filtering through a single window. But something urged me upward. As I pulled open the old cardboard boxes, I found fragments of a life I had almost forgotten, letters from college, theater programs from school plays, notebooks filled with half-written stories. At the bottom of one box, I discovered a stack of our parents' letters. I sat cross-legged on the floor, dust rising around me, and began to read. Their handwriting pulled me back to a different time, each line filled with their voices. One letter, written by my father, struck me hardest. Remember, no matter what the world tells you, you know your own worth. Don't let anyone else define it. I pressed the page to my chest and closed my eyes. Those words, written years ago, felt as if they were meant for this exact moment. That afternoon, I walked into town. The streets buzzed with life, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, children spilling out of a bakery with cookies in hand, a woman tugging her dog away from a lamppost. I moved slowly, letting myself blend into the crowd. I realized how long it had been since I had walked without a purpose, without rushing from one obligation to another. I found myself in front of a small bookstore I hadn't visited in years. Its windows were cluttered with second-hand novels, faded posters announcing author talks long past. On impulse, I stepped inside. The air smelled of paper and ink, warm and familiar. I wandered the aisles, running my fingers along spines, until I stopped at a shelf labeled local authors. There, tucked between two larger books, was a slim collection of essays by someone whose name I didn't recognize. I flipped it open and read a passage about reclaiming one's life after betrayal. The words were simple, but they sank into me like water to dry earth. I bought the book, carried it home, and read late into the night. By the time I finished, I wasn't healed, not even close. But I felt seen. And sometimes, being seen is the first step toward becoming whole again. The next morning, I decided to call my sister. My hand trembled as I dialed, my thumb hesitating above the final digit. When her voice came through, it was curt. I was wondering when you'd call. I read what you put in front of me, I said. And I need to understand why. Her sigh was heavy, tired. Because it's easier this way. Because you never wanted the responsibility. Because dragging this out helps no one. You think you know what I wanted, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But you never asked me. There was silence on the other end, the kind that feels like a door being closed. It's done, she said finally. You can fight it if you want. But I'm not changing anything. The line went dead. I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear long after the call ended. Her words didn't surprise me, they confirmed what I had already feared. But hearing them aloud still cut deep. For her, this wasn't about compromise. It was about control. That night, I didn't cry. Instead, I wrote again. Pages and pages poured out of me, my anger, my grief, my memories. I wrote about the smell of our mother's perfume, the way she would hum as she cooked. I wrote about my father's laugh, deep and steady, filling the room like sunlight. I wrote about my sister, the way she used to braid my hair before school, the way she used to slip me notes during family dinners. And then I wrote about the woman she had become, the woman who could look me in the eye and ask me to erase myself with a signature. It wasn't neat, it wasn't eloquent. But it was mine. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed small changes in myself. I started taking long walks after dinner, letting the rhythm of my steps clear my head. I began cooking meals I hadn't made in years, recipes my mother had taught me, filling the kitchen with scents that reminded me of home. I even reached out to an old friend, someone I had drifted from over the years, and we met for coffee. She listened as I spoke, really listened, without judgment or interruption. When we parted, she hugged me tightly and said, you're stronger than you think. That night, as I washed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked tired, yes, but there was something else too. A steadiness. A quiet defiance. I realized then that my sister had taken something from me, but she hadn't taken everything. She couldn't. Because the core of who I was, my memories, my values, my resilience, didn't exist on any legal document. They lived inside me. And no signature could erase them. It didn't make the pain disappear. Betrayal doesn't dissolve overnight. It lingers, sharp and jagged. But for the first time since that day in the lawyer's office, I felt a flicker of power. The smallest hint that this story wasn't finished yet, and that I had a say in how it unfolded. The weeks stretched into a kind of uneasy rhythm. Life carried on, work, errands, conversations with neighbors that skimmed only the surface, but underneath, a current tugged at me constantly. Some mornings I would wake feeling almost normal, only for the memory of the folder and my sister's voice to flood in before I'd even finished my first sip of tea. I didn't tell many people about what happened. Part of me felt ashamed, as though admitting the truth would confirm the image she had painted of me, passive, incapable, someone who couldn't hold their ground. But silence had its own weight, pressing down on me until I felt I might collapse under it. That was when I began journaling more deliberately, not just scribbles in the night but a practice. Each morning, before I faced the day, I would sit at my desk, notebook open, and pour myself onto the page. The words didn't heal me, but they steadied me. They gave shape to the mess inside. One entry began with a sentence I couldn't stop repeating: "She doesn't get to tell my story." I wrote it 3 times, each line darker, the pen carving the words into the page. I stared at it afterward, my hands still trembling, and realized that was the root of everything. It wasn't just the legal matter, or the inheritance, or whatever convenient justification she clung to. It was that she had tried to decide who I was, without even giving me the dignity of asking. One evening, I received an invitation to a community dinner at the church hall. Normally, I might have ignored it. Those gatherings often felt crowded, noisy, full of people with small talk I couldn't quite stomach. But something urged me to go. Maybe I needed to feel part of something larger than the closed circuit of my own thoughts. The hall was warm and buzzing with life when I arrived. Tables lined with casseroles and salads stretched the length of the room. People milled about with plates in hand, laughter echoing off the high ceilings. At first, I hovered at the edges, unsure where to place myself. But then an older woman I barely knew came up and touched my arm. "It's good to see you here," she said simply, and the warmth in her eyes made my throat tighten. We sat together, and she asked nothing personal, nothing probing. We spoke about gardens and the unseasonably warm weather. Yet in that simple exchange, I felt something loosen in me. It reminded me that the world was still filled with people who didn't want to take from me, who weren't calculating what I could give or lose. When I returned home that night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat at the table with my tea. The house was quiet, the shadows stretching across the walls, and for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt peaceful. But peace was fleeting. A letter arrived the next morning, crisp and official, with the lawyer's name in the corner. My stomach tightened as I slit the envelope open. Inside, the words were blunt: "If you continue to withhold your signature, proceedings will be delayed, incurring additional costs and complications." I sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore, it was about pressure, about being boxed in. They wanted me to bend not only emotionally but practically. To make me feel foolish, stubborn, out of step with reason. For a long time, I just sat there, the letter spread out before me. Then I folded it neatly, placed it in the drawer with my notebook, and whispered aloud, "No." It was a small act, almost absurd in its simplicity. But saying the word, even to an empty room, made me feel steadier. I wasn't refusing out of spite or fear. I was refusing because I mattered, because my voice mattered, even if my sister wished otherwise. That night, I dreamed of my parents. My mother was humming in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, while my father sat at the table with his newspaper. I stood in the doorway, watching them, a child again for a moment. My mother looked up and smiled at me, and the sound of her humming wrapped around me like a blanket. I woke with tears on my cheeks, but also with a strange calm. It was as though they were reminding me that I wasn't alone, even if the world felt that way. In the days that followed, I began doing small things for myself. I bought a scarf in a shade of green I'd always loved but never worn. I baked bread from scratch, filling the house with a warmth that clung to the walls. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, shifting the weight of the space until it felt like mine again. None of it solved the larger problem, but each act whispered a quiet truth: I was still here, shaping my life in ways that were mine to choose. And yet, grief lingered. Some evenings, I would sit with a glass of wine and let the memories wash over me, birthdays shared, secrets whispered, moments of laughter that now felt stolen. I would think about calling her, telling her what she had done to me, how she had broken something that might never mend. But then I would imagine her silence, or worse, her dismissal, and the phone would remain untouched. One Sunday afternoon, I walked past the lawyer's office, the blinds drawn, the building quiet. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the door, remembering the way my sister had left me sitting there, abandoned. A passerby glanced at me curiously, but I didn't move. I let myself feel the full weight of that memory, the humiliation, the shock, the loneliness. And then I turned and walked away, my steps firm, as though I was leaving more than just a building behind. At home that evening, I sat with my notebook and wrote only one sentence. She asked me to erase myself, but I said no. And for the first time, the words didn't feel fragile. They felt like stone. The letter sat in the drawer for days, a silent threat folded between pages of my notebook. I knew it was waiting, that eventually there would be another, harsher in tone, more insistent in its demands. Each time I opened the drawer to write, I would see the corner of the envelope peeking out, and it was as though the paper itself was breathing down my neck. But instead of frightening me, it began to harden something inside me. I wasn't naive. I knew my sister was counting on me to cave, to grow weary of the pressure. She had always been good at that, at framing her choices as inevitabilities. Even when we were children, she had a way of deciding things for both of us, as though my voice was an afterthought. I had mistaken it for confidence, or perhaps even care. But now I saw it for what it was, control disguised as certainty. One evening, after work, I stopped by our parents' house. It had been empty since their passing, the windows shuttered, the garden overgrown. The keys felt cold in my hand as I unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, tinged with the faintest trace of my mother's perfume and the cedar polish my father used on the furniture. Dust coated the surfaces, but everything was where it had always been. Their world paused. I walked from room to room, my footsteps echoing. In the living room, the sofa sagged just slightly where my father used to sit. In the kitchen, the old spice rack still held jars with faded labels. I ran my fingers along the counter, remembering the countless meals prepared there, the voices that had once filled the space with warmth. And then, standing in the hallway, I felt it, the full weight of what she was trying to strip from me. This house wasn't just walls and furniture. It was memory. It was belonging. It was the one place that reminded me I had come from love, from something steady and real. She wanted me to sign that away as though it were nothing more than a transaction. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where our mother had served us bowls of soup on winter nights, and I whispered aloud, "I can't let you take this from me." The words didn't feel like defiance anymore. They felt like truth. The next day, I called the lawyer's office and asked to schedule a meeting, just me, no sister this time. When I arrived, the receptionist looked startled, but ushered me in. The lawyer's expression was carefully neutral as I sat across from him. I placed my notebook on the desk, my hands steady. "I won't sign," I said simply. "And I need you to make that clear." For the first time, his mask slipped slightly. He adjusted his glasses and nodded. "You understand there will be consequences. Delays, costs." I understand, I interrupted. My voice surprised me, calm, firm. But I also understand what's at stake. And it's more than money. He didn't argue further. He made a note in his file, his pen scratching across the paper, and I knew then that a line had been drawn. My sister would see it not as resistance, but as betrayal of her own. But for once, I wasn't afraid of how she would paint me. That evening, I walked the long way home, past the river that cut through town. The water shimmered in the fading light, the current strong and unrelenting. I stood on the bridge, watching it surge beneath me, and thought about how grief moves the same way. It drags you, threatens to pull you under, but if you learn to stand firm, you realize it can't carry you unless you let it. In the days that followed, I began telling a few close friends the truth. Their responses varied, some were shocked, others saddened, a few quietly admitted they weren't surprised. But each time I spoke the words aloud, I felt lighter. As though by sharing the story, I was reclaiming it. It wasn't hers to define anymore. Of course, the silence from my sister grew louder. No more calls, no more clipped voicemails. Just absence. I imagined her anger, her disbelief that I wasn't folding neatly into the role she had written for me. For years, I had been the quiet one, the steady one, the one who smoothed things over. Now I was the obstacle. And perhaps that was the truest change of all. One night, unable to sleep, I sat by the window and watched the street outside. A neighbor's light flicked on across the way, a shadow passing by the curtain. The stillness of the night pressed in on me, but instead of loneliness, I felt something else, resolve. I picked up my notebook and wrote a line that came to me like a gift: sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay when you're told to leave. I read it over and over, letting the words sink into me. The next morning, I folded that page neatly and slipped it into my bag. On my lunch break, I returned to the old bookstore. I bought a blank journal, thick, bound in soft leather, and decided it would be my new beginning. The first page held only that line, written in careful script. A promise to myself. Weeks passed. Letters came and went. Each one harsher, more insistent. Each one I placed in the drawer, beside the first, and answered with silence. My sister's absence stretched on, until I could no longer remember the sound of her voice without summoning the echo of those two words, just sign. But I was no longer the person who had sat in that office, stunned and silent. I was someone else now, someone who walked through the ache instead of shrinking from it, someone who had learned to fill her own quiet with meaning. One evening, as I brewed a pot of tea, I caught myself humming. It was soft, almost unconscious, but it startled me. For a moment, I thought it was my mother's voice again. But no, it was mine. I stood there in the kitchen, steam curling upward, and I realized that in all the weeks of grief and anger, something unexpected had taken root. A kind of independence I had never known. Not the independence of solitude, but of selfhood. Of knowing that even stripped of ties I thought unbreakable, I could still stand. I poured the tea, wrapped my hands around the cup, and let the warmth seep into me. The battle wasn't over, the papers, the proceedings, the silence from my sister still loomed. But the fear had changed. It no longer ruled me. It was simply part of the landscape, like a storm on the horizon. I would weather it. And in that moment, I whispered again, this time not in defiance but in certainty, I am still here. The first frost of winter arrived quietly, dusting the edges of the grass and painting the rooftops silver. I remember standing at my kitchen window that morning, watching the breath of the world turn visible. It felt like a reminder, everything changes form, but nothing disappears entirely. Even warmth lingers in the air, even betrayal leaves a shape behind. The silence between my sister and me had stretched into months. By then, I no longer checked the phone with the same hope or dread. The letters still came, each one worded more firmly than the last, but their power over me had dulled. They no longer sent my hands trembling. I filed them away, knowing they were just paper, not prophecy. One afternoon, I returned again to our parents' house. The garden was brittle with frost, the hydrangeas withered to skeletons of themselves. I walked slowly, my breath clouding before me, and unlocked the door. The air inside was colder now, emptier, but it still wrapped itself around me in a way no other place could. I sat in the living room, on the very sofa where my father once read the paper, and let the quiet settle. I didn't cry this time. I didn't feel anger or despair. What I felt was acceptance. This house was mine, yes, but not because of legal battles or signatures withheld. It was mine because it lived in me, in the way I brewed tea the way my mother had, in the way I hummed absent-mindedly as I cooked, in the way I carried their voices like threads woven through my own. I walked through each room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, as though blessing them with my presence. And when I left, locking the door behind me, I felt no panic that it might one day belong to someone else. The memories weren't trapped within those walls. They walked with me. That evening, I met Mark for coffee. He asked, gently, if I had heard from my sister. I shook my head. She's made her choice, I said. And I've made mine. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. You seem lighter, he said. I am, I replied, surprised to realize it was true. We sat in the cafe for nearly an hour, the hum of conversation around us, the warmth of the mug steady in my hands. And for the first time in a long while, I spoke about the future instead of the past. Small things, a class I wanted to take, a trip I'd been considering, even just the idea of repainting the kitchen. The words felt ordinary, but they carried a kind of quiet joy. On the walk home, the sky was deepening into twilight, the first stars pricking through the darkness. I thought about how my sister had tried to define me with silence and papers, with assumptions and control. But she had failed. Because here I was, still moving forward, still dreaming, still choosing. In the weeks that followed, I began to make changes. Not grand, sweeping gestures, just shifts that spoke to the life I wanted. I signed up for that class, a writing workshop held in the evenings. Sitting among strangers, notebooks open, pens scratching against paper, I felt a belonging I hadn't known in years. Each exercise drew out parts of me I had forgotten, the playful, the curious, the daring. At home, I started redecorating the spare room into a small studio, a place just for me. I painted the walls a soft cream, placed my desk by the window, and lined the shelves with books I had collected over the years. It became my sanctuary, a space that reminded me daily that my voice had weight, that my story was mine to tell. And yet, even with all this, my sister was never far from my thoughts. I wondered if she ever thought of me, if she ever felt the loss of what we had been. Some nights I dreamed of her, sometimes we were children again, laughing in the garden, other times we were strangers, walking past each other without recognition. I would wake with a heaviness in my chest, but also with clarity. Not all wounds are meant to heal in this lifetime. Winter deepened. Snow fell in thick sheets, blanketing the streets, muffling the world. I walked through it often, the crunch of my boots steady, the air sharp against my cheeks. There was something cleansing about it, the way the snow covered everything, erasing the clutter and noise, leaving only stillness. One morning, after a heavy snowfall, I stood outside my house and simply listened. The world was hushed, softened. For a long moment, I let myself imagine that this was what forgiveness sounded like. Not reconciliation, not a return to what once was, but a quiet acceptance of what now is. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the leather journal. On the first page still sat the line I had written weeks before, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay when you're told to leave. I smiled at it, then turned the page and began to write again. This time, not about grief or betrayal, but about possibility. About the ways we begin again, even when the world tries to end us. I don't know what will happen with the papers. Maybe there will be court dates, hearings, lawyers reciting arguments in rooms that smell of polish and tension. Maybe she will win, maybe she won't. But I know now that the outcome doesn't define me. Because when I look in the mirror, I no longer see the stunned woman who sat in that office, blindsided and broken. I see someone who walked through the fire and came out carrying her own light. I see someone who refused to erase herself. And as I sit here tonight, pen in hand, candle flickering on the desk, I realize that perhaps this was never really about my sister at all. It was about me, learning, finally, to choose myself. The last words I write before closing the journal are simple, but they carry the weight of everything I've lived through. I am still here. And that is enough.